I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hello, this is Mike Swanson. In a few moments, you're going to listen to another segment of Parallax Views. But before you do that, let me tell you about my new book, Why the Vietnam War. It's a sequel to my previous book called The War State, which has lots of positive reviews on Amazon. It's been out for years. But this one is a more detailed case study of how American empire and national security state operate using Vietnam. And I believe it shows also how things work today, how policy is actually made and why. So grab the book on Amazon.com, Why the Vietnam War.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Gunnar, Mark, Alexander, Catherine, Tilo, Emilia, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Arlen, Bo, Gigadelic Media, Chance, Chase, Dan, David H. Y. Kellerman, Saaded 13, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we continue our coverage of the Gaza War and Israel-Palestine, this time with special guest Ambassador Karim Haggag of the Cairo Review of Global Affairs. If you're not familiar with Ambassador Haggag, he served for 25 years in Egypt's diplomatic corps and has a great deal of commentary to offer on the Israel-Palestine conflict issue, whatever you may want to call it. The focus of this conversation will be how the Gaza War transforms the Israel-Palestine conflict and how the past decades have eroded the two-state paradigm when it comes to Israel-Palestine. All that and more on this edition of the program. So, with that being said, let's get right to it with Ambassador Karim Haggag. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that was recommended to me recently. I'm very glad he could join me. It's over the holidays, so really appreciate him coming on. Karim Haggag is co-managing editor of the Cairo Review of Global Affairs, and he's had a lengthy career in Egypt's diplomatic services. He's actually served over 25 years, has experience in Egypt's diplomatic service, and we're going to be talking about Gaza. How are you doing?
Wonderful. Thank you, JG. Thank you for having me.
I guess where I want to start is maybe you could talk a little bit about your background in diplomatic work and the perspective that gives you on what we currently see happening with Israel's war in Gaza, and just your perspective on maybe the Israel-Palestine issue more generally as someone who has been a lifelong diplomat.
Sure. So like you said, I served for over 25 years as an Egyptian diplomat. And the Arab-Israeli conflict, and in particular the Palestinian issue, has been a big part of my professional preoccupation. I've worked on much of the diplomacy surrounding this conflict. I have tried to be a student of this conflict, seeing how the conflict has changed, how perspectives on addressing the conflict have also changed. Part of that background has been really very much involved with U.S. diplomacy towards the conflict. I served for most of my professional career in Washington, D.C., focusing on this issue, among others. This is a topic I am very attached to personally, intellectually, and professionally.
And what's your perspective on, I guess, how things have panned out from October 7th to now, the bombing of Gaza? And also, do you think it's fair to say that I feel like some people are forgetting that there's a bigger context to what's happening right now? It doesn't just start on October 7th. That doesn't mean that's not a justification in any way for what happened on October 7th. But I feel like we need to understand the broader history, the deeper history of what's been happening with Gaza for the years leading up to this.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, because I'll talk about Gaza in a minute, but to your broader point about sort of the broader context to this, I mean, what this war has really brought home to people like me, I think, is the extent to which the conflict has been transformed, right? I mean, what we're really seeing in this particular conflict is a reflection of how the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the parameters of the conflict, the dynamics of the conflict have really shifted over the course of the last 3 or 4 decades. I mean, what we're really seeing is, I think, that the breakdown of the idea that this conflict can be resolved in the context of 2 states, right? So partitioning the area between the Mediterranean and the Jordan between 2 independent nationalist states, so Israel and Palestine. And we've seen the erosion of the building blocks of that paradigm. We've seen the erosion of the territorial basis of that idea, right? So there's just not enough land now in the West Bank and Gaza to establish a Palestinian state. That has much to do, of course, with Israel's relentless settlement policy over the course of the last 30 years. We've seen the erosion of the political basis of that idea of partition. We've seen it on the Israeli side with the gradual shift towards ever more extreme versions of the political right. We've seen it on the Palestinian side with the division within the Palestinian national movement between Fatah and Hamas, and that reflects the territorial division between Gaza and the West Bank. And we've seen how the conflict has changed in the pattern of violence, right, between both sides. I mean, we've seen it reflected more in the emergence of this ethnic-based violence, right? It's no longer just Israelis and Palestinians, it's Arabs and Jews. And you see that increasingly, not only in the West Bank and of course now in Gaza, you also see it in Israel proper, right? We've seen that in the last round of conflict in 2021 in the mixed Arab-Jewish cities. So this is a conflict that's changing dramatically. I think what we're seeing now in the war on Gaza is a manifestation of this breakdown. So we're seeing the conflict produce ever more extreme forms of violence. Right? This is what we've seen on the attack on October 7th. I mean, the first time since the first Arab-Israeli war in 1948 that we actually see an attack by an Arab force, right, in this case Hamas, on Israel within the 1948 borders, right? So within the settlement communities in the Gaza envelope. I mean, this was a landmark development. And of course, since then, we've seen the extreme form of violence. I mean, just the relentless military onslaught inflicted by Israel on Gaza and the people of Gaza. And this is extreme violence that's already sort of breaking records in terms of the destructive impact of modern warfare. I mean, we haven't seen this type of intense warfare in decades. And so it's, I think, an important landmark in how the conflict has changed and how the dynamics of the conflict have shifted. And it's taking what I think is a very ominous turn. I mean, in terms of the prospect of, how you can put back together any sort of paradigm whereby this conflict can be settled on the basis of the old idea of partition, of two states. So there's a lot there to unpack. But what I think we're seeing is a real milestone in how the conflict has shifted.
I guess the next question in regards to everything you've just said there is, with that massive paradigm shift happening in this latest round of the conflict, what does that mean for the future? Because right now we're seeing a lot of officials here in the U.S., including President Joe Biden, saying there needs to be two states. The Palestinians need to have a state after this is all said and done. But you're saying that paradigm may be something of the past now, and attempts to revive it are going to be very difficult. So what does this mean when we say the paradigm has shifted, and what does the future look like?
It means that attempts to now revive the two-state paradigm, to put it quite bluntly and a bit simplistically, I mean, those attempts are too little and way too late, because I think, given everything I said in answer to your previous question about how the basis of the two-state paradigm has been eroded, whatever efforts now are required to sort of, put that paradigm back together will take an enormous amount of political will and diplomatic heavy lifting that just may not be there, right? It's the thought that somehow we can go back to the previous formulas of two states for two peoples, based on the Oslo paradigm, or a continuation of that process was launched in Oslo during the 1990s. That may not be there because of these shifts. And very importantly, I talked about how Israeli society has shifted. I talked about how Palestinian society has shifted. The United States as the main interlocutor in this process. I mean, the United States was the key actor that shepherded this, or tried to shepherd this process over the course of the last 3 decades. I mean, America itself has shifted in interesting ways in how it identifies with this conflict, how it perceives the conflict. And so a lot has shifted. What comes next? I think, in answer to your question, unfortunately, the trajectory we're seeing is further breakdown in terms of the dynamics of the conflict. So more violence, ever more extreme forms of violence. But then you're seeing, so we can expect a continuation of that. I mean, that is sort of the trajectory we're seeing, and it's violence that now extends beyond just the Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza. I think you're seeing spillover effects of this conflict regionally, right? So we're seeing sort of these pathways of escalation that connect what's going on in Gaza to other conflict arenas, right? We're seeing the escalation now in South Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, the potential spillover effects of this into Egypt, right, in the Sinai, into Jordan, right, with what's happening in the West Bank. So I think in the short term and in the medium term, you will see more of that, unfortunately, just more a trajectory towards extreme violence, more regional escalation. But in parallel with that, you're seeing the emergence of an alternative paradigm to two states, which is the one state, right? So now the frame that is increasingly being used to describe the reality that exists between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean is one state. That one state is Israel. Israel has complete control over the peoples that live within that state, right? Both Israelis, Palestinians, Arabs, and Jews. That form of control has increasingly been framed in terms of variations of apartheid. So that is the reality that exists. The alternative paradigm that is emerging is that if you cannot solve this conflict, if you cannot reach a settlement based on the two-state idea, then the alternative might be to try and reach a settlement within one state. And that involves an idea that is different than partition, that reframes the conflict in terms of rights, right? So a rights-based approach. If Palestinians cannot attain their national independence in their own state, then the conflict is shifting in a way that focuses on attaining their rights within a single state, right? So their civil human rights within one state that exists between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. So that paradigm, I think, is gaining currency. And obviously, we are very far from reaching any form of settlement based on that paradigm. But this is how ideas about the conflict change. This is how ideas about the conflict shift. So these are sort of the two trajectories that we're seeing. The first is, unfortunately, this extreme form of violence. But then in parallel with that, we are seeing the emergence of this alternative framework for the settlement of the conflict within one state, a single state.
Given your work in diplomacy over the years, on this show, we can be very critical of, U.S. foreign policy and things of that nature. I know that diplomacy can be difficult. It's not an easy job, but is there anyone that dropped the ball? Are there any actors, state actors or otherwise, that have dropped the ball when it comes to dealing with Israel-Palestine? Is there anyone that is really deserving of criticism in the past few decades leading up to this?
Yeah, I will anchor my response in something that I think former President Obama said. And he said that, at the beginning of right after the events of October 7th, he said, I forget his exact words, but something to the effect that we are all complicit in this, right? Meaning no one is blameless in terms of trying to establish accountability for what went wrong. So I guess the very direct answer to your question is no one is blameless here, right? Certainly, the parties to the conflict themselves are not blameless, right? The Israelis and Palestinians, the the Palestinians have a lot to account for. The fact that they have not been able to overcome their internal divide, which has greatly hampered the way they conducted their capacity for negotiations, their resilience in pushing forward for independence. It's greatly compromised the coherence of the Palestinian national movement. The Israelis certainly, I mean, there's just a lot to be said there about how Israel has systematically, I think, undermined and indeed deliberately dismantled the basis for the emergence of a two-state settlement. And there's just much to be said there. I think the United States, certainly, I mean, the way it has conducted the diplomacy throughout the years with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this has been a long-standing Arab critique of America's peace process diplomacy, that there's been much more process than peace, right? The focus on endless rounds of negotiations and processes without really the United States holding both sides to account equally for their transgressions, their mistakes, the way they have undermined the prospects of two states. And that certainly applies more to how the United States just was lacking in any accountability with respect to Israel in its sort of approach to undermine two states. And I think, and certainly the Arab side is not blameless here as well. I think those, Arab states that have been invested in the cause of Israeli-Palestinian peace certainly could have done more to push for, to push diplomatically for, I think, a resolution of the conflict. So there's no a lack of blame to go around. And unfortunately, this is where we are. And it gets back to your initial question about, the Biden administration's sudden awakening to the urgency of a two-state solution. Unfortunately, it is now too little, too late, and it may be just too complex trying to unscramble this omelet. There's been too much violence, too many settlements, the too much in terms of the shift to the right in Israel, too much in terms of the entrenched division within the Palestinian national movement. So it's a tall order, but that's where we are now.
Can you talk about the way, because I noticed that you brought this up along with a few of your other colleagues at the Cairo Review of Global Affairs in this piece entitled Scouring for Meaning and Hope in the Rubble of Gaza. You talk a little bit in that piece about the revival of existential narratives. So for Israel, that means the revival of narratives about the Holocaust. And for Palestinians, that means revival of narratives about the Nakba. Can you talk about why those narratives are so important and what it means that they're at play? Because it seemed like a salient line in your piece to talk about those narratives being existential for both parties.
Yeah, no, this is an important and I think very unfortunate development. Again, going back to the way this conflict has shifted. And those existential narratives, of course, are very, by definition, very polarized, right? So that they are, in fact, becoming a source in itself of the conflict. And they play out in different ways on both sides. So on the Israeli side, again, trying to put this in context, you have with this shift in the the Israeli political spectrum towards the right, that has been accompanied by a shift in what we might call Israeli identity politics, right? Emphasizing the Jewish nature of the state, right, as opposed to the secular democratic nation of Israel as a country since its establishment. And you've seen that in the establishment or the passing of the nation-state law that very much reflects this.
That passed, I believe, in 2018.
2018, exactly. You've seen it in the Israeli demand, the new Israeli demand that the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state. And with that, I think you have this, it's partly tied to this narrative that's always been there about the eternal victimization of Israel, right? The Jews emerging from the Holocaust to establish Israel as a safe haven for Jews. But we've seen now this unfortunate and troubling trend of framing what are perceived to be Jewish threats emanating from the Palestinian side against Israel in existential terms, meaning going back to the Holocaust. So October 7th was a Holocaust-like moment, right? And that says, I think, a lot about Jewish identity rather than sort of any tangible military threat, right? That from the Palestinian side that is able to threaten the survival of Israel as a state, right? It's perceived to be an assault on Jewish identity, as Israel as a Jewish state, and that somehow the implication of that, again, staying on the Israeli side for a moment, the implication that not only are we threatened by the Palestinians in terms of the threat they pose to Israel's character as a Jewish state, and that touches on, the demographic threat that there may be more Arabs than Jews in this land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. But it also entails the belief that any settlement of the conflict, based on two states, or of course the one state paradigm, that in itself poses an existential threat to Israel as a Jewish state. And so we see both the conflict and potentially the settlement of the conflict, framed in these existential terms. On the Palestinian side, the threat is, or the idea of an existential threat is unfortunately much more tangible, much more real. And that frame of the Nakba, right? The expulsion of Palestinians from their homes, from their land in the first Arab-Israeli conflict in 1947-48, right? Was obviously, anybody who's studied the conflict knows the extent to which that is such a traumatic event in Palestinian national consciousness. But the reason it's being revived now is because it's actually very real on the ground. It's very tangible, right? So we've actually seen the revival of expulsionist rhetoric on the Israeli side, with the rise of the far right in Israel, right? The messianic Jewish right, embodied in figures such as Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, two of the religious representatives of the religious Zionist parties within the government. It's through rhetoric like that the idea of expelling Palestinians from their land is actually now quite explicit and becoming mainstream in Israeli political discourse, right? We've seen that in the play out in the West Bank increasingly by the frequency of settler assaults on Palestinian communities in the West Bank with the deliberate aim of expelling them from their land, right? So making them displaced persons, within the West Bank. We've seen it very graphically in Gaza, right? And this is probably one of the most disturbing elements of this war, in addition, of course, to the mass killing that we've seen, 20,000 Palestinians killed and counting. We're seeing this idea of expulsion of Palestinians from their land once again in Israel, in Gaza, in a very real way, in a tangible way, right? So the Israeli military operation that has led to the depopulation of Palestinians from northern Gaza into the south, right? Roughly 1.5 million Palestinians now have been displaced because of that. We've seen calls from certain quarters of the Israeli political establishment to expel Palestinians completely from Gaza into Egypt, right? And these calls, again, they have been explicit. This is not a hidden agenda, right? This is an explicit agenda. Now, irrespective of whether this is actually a formal sort of formal objective, military objective by the Israeli military may not matter much. It may be an outcome of the military conflict now playing out in Gaza. So on the Palestinian side, it's actually quite real. It is actually happening on the ground. And of course, the implication of that, these existential narratives on both sides, is, it's a reflection of a real sense of vulnerability. And unfortunately, it makes any pathway back to diplomacy that much harder, that much more challenging.
How do you see Arab states being at play in all of this? I'm specifically thinking of Egypt because we did have, there was that Israeli intelligence ministry concept paper saying, well, we can push the Gazans into the Sinai. And I think Egypt is not wanting that to happen for a multitude of reasons. So maybe you could talk about, how this will affect the response of states like Egypt. Like how do they view what is happening?
Yeah, so that concept paper put out by the Israeli intelligence ministry is very much reflective of that agenda, that expulsionist agenda, where it lays out, in very specific programmatic terms, how this should be done. So it's actually a program for ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza. And by the way, that when we had this depopulation of Palestinians from northern Gaza to the south, right, you had Israeli ministers actually framing this as a second Nakba. Right? So yes, now Israel has achieved a second Nakba by forcing the displacement of Palestinians from northern Gaza to southern Gaza, and then eventually into Egypt, into the Sinai, as you mentioned. Now, with respect to Egypt, Egypt pushed back very hard on this. Right? The Egyptian president, President Sisi, actually declared that this would be a red line for Egypt. And he articulated the reasons, I think, for this very clearly. So the rationale was based on two considerations. The first consideration has to do with Egypt's moral responsibility towards the Israeli-Palestinian issue in general, and the Palestinian cause specifically. I mean, this is an issue that Egypt has historically, politically, diplomatically felt a great deal of attachment to this issue. And Egypt has said, we will not be a party we will not be complicit in a second Nakba, allowing Palestinians to be expelled from their home again. We will not be party to that. This is not, this was not a case of, rejecting Palestinians as refugees. I mean, Egypt has taken Palestinian wounded for treatment in Egypt. Egypt has actually taken about 9 million refugees from different conflict zones across the region. So we have refugees from Sudan, from Libya, from Syria, from Iraq, from Yemen. But for the Palestinians, it's different because of everything we know about the history of the conflict, right? They are deliberately expelled with the intention that they will never come back. So one of the core considerations that Egypt articulated was we will not be a party to that. There's a second, no less important consideration that Egypt articulated, and that has a lot to do with security. Right? So allowing Palestinians to be displaced from Gaza into the Sinai means that you allow Hamas and the idea of resistance to move from Gaza into the Sinai. And the implication of that is that you can have the Sinai, northern Sinai, being transformed into a focus of resistance operations against Israel. And that has serious implications. It has serious implications for Egyptian security. It has serious implications for Egypt's peace treaty with Israel. Right? Because now, if you transform the Sinai into a conflict zone, it becomes a zone that is now part of the broader conflict, that can potentially endanger the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, which has really been the first key breakthrough in Arab-Israeli peace. Right? So the implications of this are very serious. Right? And then you have another implication of this, is that you set a very serious precedent. If you allow this displacement to happen in Gaza, it becomes so much easier in the West Bank. And the West Bank, expelling Palestinians in the West Bank to Jordan. Right? And that relates to the old Zionist idea of Jordan, the idea that Jordan should be the Palestinian state, right? If the Palestinians want a state, they should just move into Jordan, and that can be the basis for realizing their nationalist aspirations. So the implications of this are very serious. They're serious from a moral point of view. You actually have calls for ethnic cleansing now as an explicit part of Israeli political discourse. The security implications are no less serious.
I'm glad you brought that up in regards to Egypt, because I've heard a lot of people say to me, or you hear this line, especially from some politicians in the U.S. of, oh, why doesn't Egypt accept more refugees? Or, why can't Egypt just take the Gazans in? And I've long held the view, and I didn't know that this was the view in Egypt, but I suspected it was, that, Egypt, and I would suspect a lot of other Arab states, do not want to be party to a second Nakba. They don't want to be seen as complicit in it. And I think a lot of people in the U.S. Either gloss over that, or they don't realize what the Nakba means and its significance to the Arab world.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And it unfortunately it speaks to the extent in which this idea has played out in Western discourse, it's a humanitarian issue, which of course it is. I mean, there's no denying that, right? But I think in looking at this issue in purely humanitarian terms, glosses over the extent to which this is at the core of it. It is a project for another wave of ethnic cleansing in Palestine. It is being driven by a very explicit and, let's face it, radical agenda that is emerging within the Israeli body politic, right? Again, going back to the idea of the conflict generating ever more extreme forms of violence, right? So the conflict is being radicalized. This is a very radical solution being propagated by the Israeli Jewish right, which is now firmly established in the Israeli government. It is a deliberate, premeditated, calculated agenda. These ministers that I mentioned, Smotrich, who was the Israeli finance minister, wrote explicitly about this, right? And so this is not a hidden agenda. But I think in Western political discourse, unfortunately, just looking at this in purely humanitarian terms glosses over that. Right? Egypt is dealing with this with the humanitarian aspect of this, taking in more and more Palestinians into Egypt for medical treatment, insisting, I mean, part of Egypt's diplomacy since day one of the conflict, I mean, Egypt has been absolutely adamant and pushing for maximizing the humanitarian relief that gets into Gaza, right? And really putting pressure on the United States to impress upon Israel the absolute need to dramatically increase the humanitarian assistance that gets into Gaza. So, but it's not just a humanitarian issue. I mean, we have to recognize this is unfortunately driven by what is clearly a radical agenda emerging in Israel.
Just a few more questions here. In the past, we've had Israel deal with Gaza through this strategy that, I mean, the wording for it has always kind of disturbed me. Mowing the grass. So, you just go in there and you bomb for a bit and then, you move on. Now we're in this situation where it's, I think this current round is beyond just mowing the grass. I mean, we're seeing calls for the destruction of Hamas, and yet I don't think Israel has really explained what that means. And given that you have even figures that are considered moderate by a lot of Western audiences, such as Isaac Herzog, saying there are no innocent Gazans. They're all guilty for what happened on October 7th. I feel like the distinction between Hamas and inhabitants of Gaza is almost being sort of obliterated within the discourse. And I feel as if Israel's approach, it doesn't seem like there's actually a clear strategic goal in this war. I can't really figure out what the goal is, and I don't know what the destruction of Hamas means. That's a very vague goal. So, I mean, do you think Israel has either obscured its actual goal or it just doesn't have one? It just sees, military might as the way forward when really the truth is the only thing that is going to end this is a political solution.
Yeah, this is, so you're not the only one who's been perplexed about this. I mean, if you read very serious commentaries from the U.S. And even in Israel by sort of military analysts. They are equally perplexed of trying to define the coherence, any sort of coherence or logic to the Israeli military approach to this conflict. So you're absolutely right. I mean, so mowing the grass is this euphemism that has emerged to frame or describe Israeli strategy towards groups like non-state actors like Hezbollah, but in particular with relation to Hamas. And this is the strategy that has been used throughout all of the previous rounds of conflict between both sides, going back to 2008, 2012, 2014, up until 2021, and so on. And the idea here, the logic behind this approach is a purely military operational logic, right? And it discounts completely the idea that military force can be used to actually establish the conditions for any sort of political settlement with respect to Hamas, right? You cannot negotiate with Hamas. You cannot strike a deal with Hamas. You cannot reach a political settlement with Hamas. So all you could do is repeatedly, go in and mow the grass, right? Cut them down to size, degrade their military infrastructure, kill Hamas fighters, undermine their command and control, so on and so forth. This is exactly why that if you look at the previous rounds of conflict, right, between both sides, they have all ended up with the same outcome, which is the status quo. So at the end of each round, we have the situation unchanged. Hamas is still firmly entrenched in Gaza. The standoff between Hamas and Israel continues, right? And we get back to the same situation time and time again. Now, the Israelis have told us that this time is different, right? That there can be no going back to the status quo. Mowing the grass has failed. Hamas cannot be deterred. And so now the solution, the Israeli solution, is to destroy Hamas. Now, what's interesting is that, that objective has also been framed in military operational terms, right? So because that's, bringing about the destruction of Hamas means, killing almost every single Hamas commander and fighter, completely destroying the military infrastructure. It's also been translated into this idea of uprooting Hamas as a governance framework from Gaza, right? And so there will be no Hamas, no political presence for Hamas in Gaza. And it seems to be, or it's emerging, that much of that maximalist objective has been framed as a consequence of Israel's current political situation, right? So the political leadership, Prime Minister Netanyahu, framed the conflict in these maximalist terms, perhaps for his own political agenda, right, to ensure his survival. So the longer the war continues towards this maximalist agenda, right, the more he stays in power, the more he evades accountability. But if you look at what is emerging in terms of leaks attributed to the serious military strategists within Israel, they understand that objective is not attainable, right? Completely destroying Hamas, especially as an ideology, especially as a movement embodying the idea of resistance. That is simply not attainable. Which is exactly why, if you look at the way Israel is thinking about how it approaches Gaza after the war, right? The Israel is saying that we have to stay in Gaza because we will need to continue fighting Hamas, remnants of Hamas. We have to maintain our military presence within the Gaza Strip. We need to establish a security perimeter along the entirety of the border with Gaza, inside Gaza. Right? We need to have the ability to go in and out of Gaza periodically to continue, implicitly mowing the grass again. So you see the implicit acknowledgement that this is not an attainable objective, right? And so that's a very unfortunate consequence. Yes, it is incoherent. But there's one very troubling implication of all of this, right, that derives from your question, in that unfortunately, much of the Western diplomatic approach to this conflict has bought into this idea that you can destroy Hamas, right? And that not only can you do it, but you must do it, which is why the United States and initially, at least, most of the Western capitals have gone to such lengths to give Israel more time to achieve this objective. But also, if you look at all of the discourse about the post-war, right? The framing the whole discussion about what happens in Gaza as the day after, right? Presumably, that means the day after Israel is able to destroy Hamas. But unfortunately, because that objective is now proving to be unattainable, there may never be a day after. So we may never get to the day when we can think of an alternative framework, governance framework for Gaza. We may never get to a day when we actually can talk seriously about reconstruction in Gaza. We can never get to the day after where we can talk about resettlement of displaced Palestinians within Gaza, right? So it just unfortunately sets up a situation in which that day never comes, right? Because we're seeking to achieve an objective which is unattainable. So the extent to which the United States has been wedded to this concept has delayed, unfortunately, the diplomacy. There's very little diplomacy to talk about. Has unfortunately exacted a huge price, an exorbitant price in Palestinian lives, and just the sheer destruction that has been visited on Gaza. And it may present us a situation in which we are stuck with this new, very harsh reality for a long time.
I'm curious, did you happen to see the Israeli ambassador to the UK? She was on TV recently saying, there's not going to be a two-state. Do you think statements like that are significant?
They're significant only in the extent that they are explicit and blunt in reflecting what has been the mainstream view within Israel for decades, right? I mean, the only difference is the fact that she said this explicitly, bluntly in English, directed to a Western audience. That is really the significance of it. But is she reflecting anything new? I mean, is this a new departure for the Israeli political objectives? No. I mean, this is where the Israeli mainstream has been for quite some time now. Just not only not considering the idea of a Palestinian state, but like I said, doing everything possible to undermine the prospects of the emergence of a Palestinian state. I mean, that is actually a big part of how we got here, right? The division between the West Bank and Gaza, between Fatah and Hamas, right? I mean, much of that has been, like I said, of the Palestinians' own making, right? Just the divisions within the Palestinian national movement. But once those divisions emerged, they were actively deepened and encouraged by Israel itself. I mean, Netanyahu himself worked actively. I mean, this is, something that will be the subject of much accountability moving forward. Netanyahu actively worked to make sure that that division is entrenched, to work with Hamas as an alternative to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, right? Because the Palestinian Authority was seen, rightly so, as embodying, the nucleus of a Palestinian state, a future Palestinian state. So rather than engage with the PA in the West Bank, Netanyahu did everything possible to undermine the Palestinian Authority and work with Hamas, right? Entrenching Hamas in Gaza, undermining the prospects for Palestinian reconciliation. I mean, this was an agenda that Egypt worked on for decades, trying to overcome that divide between Fatah and Hamas, which was extremely difficult in itself because the division was quite deep. But an added source of difficulty was the extent to which the Israeli government and Netanyahu specifically worked to undermine that reconciliation. And this is a big part of how we got to October 7th, right? Because for Hamas, the logic that seems to have driven Hamas in launching October 7th was it needed to break out of this very constricted reality it found itself in. Not being able to break out of Gaza politically or diplomatically, it decided to break out militarily. And so, yes, I mean, it is a very unfortunate reality of where we are, but it speaks to the bigger the bigger trajectory here, right? Because your question about the Israeli ambassador to London, her comments, about just the complete rejection of a Palestinian state. Well, we are seeing the alternative to that. We are seeing now the way this conflict has been transformed. This is simply a reflection of the fact that we have not been able to solve this conflict on the basis of two states.
I just had two more questions and I'll let you go because I know I've kept you a bit longer. But, we've talked quite a bit about Netanyahu, and I think there's an emerging narrative here in the U.S. that, the problem is Netanyahu. The problem is the Likud party. And once the Likud party is, gone or out of power, or Netanyahu is gone and out of power, we'll have a Benny Gantz or a Yair Lapid, and things will just sort of magically get better. And I think this ignores the fact that, the settlement expansion has gone on under parties that weren't Likud. Do you think it's foolhardy, I guess, for people to assume that these problems will be fixed if, the Likud's power is diminished in Israel? And to be fair, I think it would be good if a Netanyahu was gone, if the Likud party's power was diminished, but I'm not sure it's the key to fixing everything.
Yeah, I wish I could be in a position to say, to agree with that assumption that yes, if Likud is somehow out of power, that there is an alternative there within the Israeli political spectrum that will engage seriously with the idea of, getting back to a diplomatic pathway to a two-state settlement. I wish that were the case, but unfortunately, it's not there. The alternatives, what we have in Israel now is not the traditional political divide between, the right and the center left. What we have is different shades of right, right? So yes, we may get a different shade of right with figures such as Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid. But if you look at what they themselves are saying, I mean, they are openly coming out, and even before October 7th, but especially since October 7th, saying that there is no prospect for getting to a Palestinian state. Right? And they articulate, their different rationales for that, but they all point to the same outcome, that no, this is not something that will be seriously entertained by these different political alternatives. So no, I mean, the idea that, if Netanyahu goes, there will emerge someone that the Biden administration and Palestinians and Arabs in general can consider a partner for moving to a two-state solution, that doesn't seem to be there. Now, that said, thoughtful Israeli commentators point to the very interesting parallels between October 7th, 2023, and October 6th, 1973, right? So as a result of the October War in 1973, you had the war set in motion a very interesting, again, political shift that sort of went through its own cycle that produced the change in government from Labor to Likud, right? So Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin were out, and we had Begin and the Likud party coming into power. So a shift to the right, but a shift that that paved the way for peace with Egypt under a Likud government. And so, thoughtful Israeli commentators make the claim that some variation of this can happen again, right? Given just the extent of the sheer shock that was produced by October 7th, 2023. I really have no view on that idea, on that prospect. It's a hopeful prospect, but one that seems very distant from where we are today.
The very last thing I wanted to ask you, I know we said that there's a little bit of blood on everyone's hands when it comes to this broader conflict. However, I think the narrative we get in the U.S. can best be summed up by, well, I'll put it this way. I was watching, I think it was ABC News or The View or one of those shows here in the U.S. recently, and Hillary Clinton was on, and she was asked about Obama's comments where he said, there's a lot of guilty parties in all of this. And she said, I think what he meant, and then she went into a long diatribe about Arafat and basically saying it's all Arafat's fault. He didn't take the deal when my husband was in power. It's Arafat dropped the ball. And I feel like that's a particular narrative that I hear a lot in the U.S. here, which is, well, these Palestinian leaders just didn't take a good deal when it was given to them. It's all their fault. They let their people down. And I feel like that narrative places way too much on Palestinians, and it leaves out the fact that, Israel hasn't always been generous with its offers. Would you be able to talk about maybe the Palestinian and Arab perspective on diplomatic efforts and where maybe they see Israel falling short? Because I think in the U.S. we hear where, Palestinians fell short, But we never hear the other side of that. We never hear the response that maybe Arab voices have to those accusations.
Yeah, so I mean, this was a very important episode in Arab-Israeli peacemaking, right? What Hillary Clinton is referring to is the Camp David summit convened by her husband, then President Bill Clinton, at Camp David in 2000, bringing Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and the late Yasser Arafat to Camp David to try and reach a final settlement agreement to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So this was one of the rare moments where there was an attempt to actually reach a final status settlement to the conflict, right? That would deal with all of the core issues to the conflict, right? The borders of a Palestinian state, the disposition of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, security arrangements in that territory, the status of Jerusalem and the holy places, the very sensitive issue of the right of return of Palestinian refugees, and how that would play out. So there's no doubt it was a serious attempt. The narrative that this failed because of Palestinian refusal of what was a very generous offer made by the Israeli side is unfortunately, yes, as you implied, simplistic and just simply not true. If you go back to the negotiating record of Camp David and the lead up to Camp David, many parties involved, including the Palestinians, including Egypt, which was very closely involved in the lead up to this, we're saying that look, what's happening is that the Israelis are essentially negotiating with themselves about what they think would be the best deal that the Palestinians should accept. And once the Israelis make a determination amongst themselves as to what the parameters of that deal should be, then they present it to the United States, the Clinton administration, and it would be incumbent upon the U.S. side to present this to the Palestinians as a take it or leave it agreement. This has been the Palestinian view, backed up by the general Arab view, but it's also actually been the view of certain American negotiators, U.S. negotiators that were heavily involved with the peace team at the time. I mean, they said variations of what I'm saying, essentially. So rather than chalk this up as a failed attempt that could have been built on subsequently to try and reach a viable agreement, it's been painted, unfortunately, as with this narrative that the Palestinians rejected this overly generous offer, and hence the Palestinians never pass an opportunity to pass an opportunity, which is the traditional Israeli refrain against Palestinians. But unfortunately, so it's a narrative that plays out negatively against the prospect of getting back to a pathway to two states. But unfortunately, it's if we look at this logically, it's not actually very relevant because it doesn't change the very disturbing trajectory that we have been on since that moment, right? Since the moment when the peace process essentially collapsed, right? And with various attempts to revive it after that, but unsuccessfully. The trajectory we've been on is what brought us to this point. that we're discussing today. I mean, I actually remember listening to then Secretary Clinton when she was in the Obama administration, talking about this very issue, the idea that the conflict is on a very dangerous trajectory. Right? It's on a very dangerous trajectory militarily. It's on a dangerous trajectory demographically, and certainly politically. Right? So she herself was making the case, after this whole Camp David episode that she sort of spoke about very negatively, as you pointed out. Later when she was in the Obama administration, she was pointing this out, that, look, we're on a very dangerous pathway here, and we have to get back to some form of negotiated solution. Otherwise, the implications of this will all be very negative. And I think that's an important case study of, how these narratives are unfortunately propagated simplistically for political purposes, and that really just divert our attention from the urgency of the moment and just the very complex history of the conflict that brought us to this moment.
I want to thank you, Karim, for coming on Parallax Views. I want to give you the floor to make any final comments. What do you hope, I guess, listeners get out of this conversation? What's the most important aspect you think people should take out of this?
Yeah, I'm hoping people would take out of this that in the attempt, we're all, I think, most of your viewers, I think these are very serious conversations that you've had on Parallax. I've listened to some of them. I think they're serious, they're in depth. So I'm presuming most of your viewers are, serious people who are in one way or another attached or invested in this conflict. And it's very easy for people who are emotionally or personally attached to retreat into their tribal narratives, right? And this has been a very polarizing conflict. And we've seen this play out, I think, in very interesting ways in the debate and the activism around this conflict, certainly in the West. The whole polarization and the debate on U.S. college campuses, I think, is very interesting to watch. The way this conflict has now become anchored in a very big way in the global justice movement, as the Palestinian cause, and just the rejection of what I've described as this extreme violence. I mean, just the death, the horrific death toll, the sheer extent of the destruction, the revival of these existential narratives. We're talking about genocide, we're talking about ethnic cleansing. I mean, these are very extremely disturbing developments. So it's very easy for people to retreat into their sort of comfort zone, their corner, their own tribal narrative. But I think that doing that, I think we have to escape that that penchant of retreating into our own corner, because we have to see the extent to which this will claim a very heavy toll on both sides. And I think, difficult as it is, that there needs to be not only an empathy with the suffering of the other side, but there really needs to be a drive to overcome the very serious implications of the moment, to try and get back to a pathway towards a solution.
I don't want to cut in, but I just wanted to add to that very briefly. I recently had the Palestinian historian Rashid Halidi on, and he said something that very much stuck with me, and I want to bounce this out off you. He said, Israel's strategy in a lot of ways, especially under Netanyahu, has been one of thinking that you can maintain security through creating permanent insecurity for another population, in this case, the Palestinians. And Halidi said to me, it hurts the Palestinians, but it also doesn't create security for Israeli Jews. And to me, that's the biggest tragedy of all of this, is that, I don't think Israeli Jews or Palestinians are better off with this trajectory at all. I think it hurts both of them in the long run.
The biggest threat to Israeli security and the cohesion of or the viability of Israel as a state is the occupation. I think it needs to be phrased in these very blunt, very direct terms. Many in Israel have recognized this. Many in Israel have understood the extent to which the occupation, maintaining the occupation, is having a corrosive effect on Israel's society, on Israel's global standing, on Israel's, sense of itself as, a state and a society that embodies progressive, liberal Jewish values. I think it's very interesting how certain Jewish communities in the West have really taken up the cause of expressing that, look, the state of Israel cannot do what it's doing in our name, right? In the defense of Jews, it stands against everything we have been educated with and socialized in, everything we've been led to believe about Jewish values. So yes, it is certainly the biggest threat to Israeli security is the occupation. That said, that recognition now is bumping against the very harsh realities, the existential narratives that are emerging within Israel, the sense of vulnerability now in Israel, the very harsh realities Israel has created in the occupied territories in the West Bank and certainly now in Gaza. So one can only hope that, that recognition will lead to a course correction that we could hope will emerge in Israel towards a different path, towards a different trajectory for this conflict.
Well, hey, Karim Haggag, I want to thank you again for coming on Parallax Views. My listeners can keep up with your work at the Cairo Review, right?
Correct. Yes, we are doing extensive coverage of this conflict. So happy to have your listeners stay tuned. All of our content is free. So yes, this is the Cairo Review is a platform that really tries to provide a forum for views from the region, essentially, on issues of global affairs. And we've been dedicating much of our coverage to Arab-Israeli issues. And we have a special issue of the journal coming out on the conflict in Gaza very soon.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Ambassador Karim Haggag. As always, if you appreciate the work here I do at Parallax Views, I must emphasize that it is you, dear listeners, that keep this show going. Other than one advertiser, the mighty Mike Swanson of Wall Street Window, it is you, the listener, that keeps this show afloat with your financial contributions on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/Parallax Views. And with that being said,
until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views. To Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.